Welcome back to the Foundation in C# course. We're currently in Module 2, and this lesson we're going to cover methods. Now, methods are foundational to C#, and we've already used them, but now we're going to learn how to create them. So let's jump right into the code and get to seeing what a method is and how to use it. So our console UI. And this is Module 2, Lesson 12. And the first thing you do is console.readLine. And guess what? That's actually a method. Now, I covered this at the beginning, but we're going to cover it again a little bit. This right here is a method. A method does something. It's a chunk of code that we run, and we get to just call it by its name instead of rewriting that chunk of code. We wouldn't survive without methods. I mean, think about this. When I do just this little bit of code and I hit start, it's going to launch this window right here. It's going to have the cursor. It's going to be at this spot on this window, the whole 9 yards. Well, all this stuff was created somehow. The window itself, the fact that it's got the minimize, the maximize, the close, this right here, the menu, all the different options, all that was created somehow. I didn't have to write all this code to tell you how to display a window, a console window, because we built on the shoulders of previous applications. Even just as simple as this read line here, which waits for user input and then captures it. I didn't have to write the code to figure out how to actually talk to the console. It's just bundled up in this console.readLine. Well, we're going to create today our own methods. And so the first thing to point out is a method should do one thing. So you think about the console read line. What does console readLine do? It reads the information off the console, a whole line of it. That's all it does. It doesn't do anything else. It just does that one thing. When we talk about the console write line, another method, it does one thing. It writes out something to the console, whether it's just the line return or whether it's a message. That's all it does, is it writes to the console. It doesn't also read, just writes. So a method does one thing. So let's create a couple of methods. Now the first method we're going to create is going to just give us kind of the information about who created this application. It's kind of like a signature line or a stamp or something like that that would tell everybody this is who created the application. So let's start right down here outside, for the first time, outside of these curly braces for static void main. Static void main is a method. It's a special method, but it's a method. We're going to create outside these curly braces, but still inside the curly braces for this class. So that's very important where you put it. Inside the class, outside of our existing main method. So let's call this private. We're going to cover the different modifiers in a future lesson. But for right now, what private means is it's only available to other methods inside of class program. So private, static, and again, we're going to cover static in a future lesson. But essentially for right now, everything is going to be static. When we take static off, it's because we're learning object-oriented programming. We're not there yet. Once we get there, it'll make sense why you say static versus not static. So for now, just put static on everything, every method. Public static void. This is what it returns. So a method can return data. But in our case, I don't want to return any data. So I would say void. Void means no data. So private static void and we're going to give it a name of the method. And let's just call it say authors or author. And open and close paren, and then open and close curly braces. So this is the name of the method. Now, previously when we've been naming things, we've been naming variables. And variables have camel case. Camel case meaning the lowercase first word, the whole first word, and then every word after that gets an uppercase for the first letter. Methods fit in the same category as our projects, our solutions, and even our classes. And that is their Pascal case. And by Pascal case, I mean that every word, the first letter is capitalized. So say author, capital S, capital A. It's pretty important that you follow this naming convention because it's pretty much a given industry standard. It also helps protect us when we have complex applications because when we name things, it's case sensitive. So I could have a variable, let's just say it's a string variable called say author, and that's okay. I just can't have one that says say author with a capital S in the beginning because now I'm stepping on the toes of my method. So this allows us to not step on toes of each other by having these naming conventions. So private static void say author. It's got an open and close paren. Now the parens are there because this inside the parens is where we pass in data. If you want to pass in variables, which we call parameters, you could do that here. We're not going to do that yet. This is the simplest of methods. It takes in no parameters. It returns no data. So let's say that this say author method, we're going to say console write line, and then let's do this. We'll do all those like, the star line, and then we'll do written by Tim Corey, and then we'll have one more line that's for the foundation in C# course. Something like that. Then I'll copy this line again and paste it at the end. Okay, so it's going to print out in the console this information. That's all it's going to do. Now in my static void main, I can say author. Now I have to add open and close paren and a semicolon. Now, calling this right here is going to go out to this private method and run this code. When it gets to the end here, it's going to come right back up here and go to the next line in my main code, my main method. Let's run this and see it. And there you go. Written by Tim Corey for the Foundation in C# course. And that's not really that overwhelming because we could have just put this code right up here. But check this out. What if I did this? And I run this. Well, there you go. It executes 4 times. And you may say, yeah, but Tim, you could have just copied and pasted this code down here 4 times up here. I could have. But what if I find a bug? Like, you know what? I don't want to be called Tim. I want to be called Timothy. I don't, but let's just say I did. Well, I changed it once. And if I run this, notice it's changed all 4 times. If instead I had copied and pasted this code, let's just say I want to go back to Tim, and I'm going to copy and paste this code in here instead. Like, okay, I want this to be Tim. So I come in here and go, yep, Tim. And I want this to be Tim. Yep, there we go. And, oh, yep, Tim. And I run this. Tim, Timo, Timothy, Tim. Now, obviously, this is a little contrived because probably I'd see the fact that I have 3 different ways of saying Tim. But in the real world, you don't. Because in the real world, these aren't all in the same file. They're not all next to each other, and they don't all look exactly the same. So you're trying to hunt down all these different ways you're doing it and change them all because an algorithm changed or because of how you're doing things changed. Instead, if you're calling this code multiple times, let's just pretend we are, changing it in one spot changes it everywhere. So that's one of the benefits of methods. Now, the other benefit is that you can describe in the method name what this does. Say author. Well, that's pretty clear what it's doing. It's going to say the author. You could say print author info to console. And yes, that's a long method name, but at the same time, it describes it. If one method was alert users, and then inside there it called two different methods, one that was send email and another that was send text message, that's perfectly fine. So it's going to take some work, and that's why we're going to practice this over and over and over again. Because getting this right will really help your applications be more maintainable, easier to understand, easier to debug. And easy is awesome. So let's try and focus on that. Now, the other nice thing is, and this is a Visual Studio thing, if you notice right here, there's a little minus sign in a box. If I click that, it collapses this method down to just its signature. This is what's called its signature. What it passes out and what it passes in the name. So just having this allows us to have our code window have a little more space. We don't have to see this code and some more code. So that's kind of helpful to collapse things down. It's up to you if you want to do it or not. We don't want to have thousands of lines of code in this one window, and we're going to see how to break it apart in different windows in a future video. But for right now, we're going to stay in this one window. So this does help us kind of make it a little easier to read through our application. Now, one final note before we go on to another method is that this static void main, which I've covered before, this is a special method. This is the entry point to our application. So when C# compiles this, when Visual Studio compiles this into an executable, it says, okay, when you run the executable, I'm going to look for a static void main. And that's where I'm going to start. So this is where the application starts, and this is where it ends. But as you noticed, when we say author, it opens up this method and runs all the code in here before it continues back on down to here. So that allows us to have tons of code we can run through before we get to this end curly brace. Okay, so let's create another method. So this method, what we're going to do is we're going to say private static, still void, so it's going to return nothing. But this time, we're going to say welcome user. We're going to say string first name. So what welcome user does is it's going to welcome the user. And it's going to do that by saying hello Tim or hello Bob or hello Sue. But it doesn't know if it's Tim, Bob, or Sue. Well, we're going to pass in a first name. So this is a parameter. And it looks like a variable because that's really kind of what it is. It's declaring that I need a first name of type string. Okay? So now we can pretend that we already have that because we can't call this method until we pass in a variable of type string. So we could say console writeline, $, double quotes, hello, first name. And that's all we're going to do. Okay? And maybe in a real application, we have more stuff here. Well, glad to see you, whatever. But for right now, that's it. Hello, first name. So up here, we want to call that. So maybe we'll call it after author instead. So we're going to say the author, and then we're going to welcome the user. But if I just do this, it says, no, you can't do that. Because it says there's no argument given that corresponds to the required formal parameter first name. What's saying is, you need a first name. Pass one in. Well, I could say Tim. That works. In fact, let's just see that. Let's run this. There's my who is the author, and then there's hello Tim. Now that's interesting, but that's also string literal. Well, no problem. What if I said console.write, what is your first name? And then said string, I'm going to say name, not first name. And there's a reason for this. Equals console.readLine. And then I'll say welcome user name. Okay, I'm going to comment this one out because we don't need to say it twice. Why did I call this name? Well, I wanted to just stress the point that this first name right here has no relationship to the variable you pass in. So the variable I have here is called name. The parameter is called first name. That's fine. Not a problem. All it's doing is taking the value of name and passing that into welcome user. That value goes into the first name field of the parameter list. So its first name now has whatever you passed in from the name value. And that name gets used when I say hello and the first name. So let's just run this again. And this time it says, what's your first name? Sue. Hello, Sue. Okay, so it read the console, it captured that into the And the contract says you're going to return a string, but you're not yet. So therefore, I'm not going to work because you told me we're going to return a string, but we're not returning a string. That's just a setup thing, okay? You create a method, you haven't yet put the code in. So don't worry about that red squiggly line yet, because it's going to go away as long as you write the application correctly. So let's take this code right here. I'm going to copy it, and I'm going to paste it in here. The one thing I'm going to change is I'm going to say output. Now, this is my personal syntax. And the reason I say it's output is because I name the variable that I'm going to return. So the value of this variable right here called output, that's what goes back to the caller. That's what I want to send back. So I call it output just to be very clear so that when I say return output, it's very clear. Okay, now return, that statement is saying send this value back. This value is a string value, which we said it was going to be a string value. We can't return int. We have to return a string. We can't return a Boolean. We have to return a string. That's what we promised. That's what we're going to do. So we return our string, in this case, output. Now I could have called this first name instead of return first name. That's fine, but I prefer to say output so that if I have 50 lines of code in this method and I have, let's just say 10 variables, I don't want to return accidentally the wrong variable. This way, by calling it output, I know I'm returning that variable. I don't have to think about it. So, what's your first name? It captures it. It gets that value into this string output, and then it returns that value. So now instead of this right here, we can get rid of that. And we can say instead of string name equals console readline, we can say string name equals get user's name. We don't have to pass anything in, but the value that comes back is a user's name. It goes into our name variable. And then that gets passed in for welcome users. Let's see how this works. What is your first name? Bob. Hello, Bob. So nothing really changed, but now our method, our static void main says say author, got it. Get user's name and put it in this variable, okay. Welcome the user and pass in their name, okay. And then read line. So that's all there is to our method. We can read down through and kind of almost read it like a book. Say the author, I understand. And you go down through. Oh, I understand what that's doing. Oh, that's capturing the value into this variable, which we then use for this. Welcome user. So it makes sense time after time. Now, what if we wanted to welcome the user by their first name and their last name? Well, then we would have to pass in a second parameter here. How do we do that? Well, let's do that. Let's refactor what we have here. So let's start with our welcome user. I'm going to say string last name. We're going to pass in first name and last name. Then here I'll say last name. Now that's fine, but up here it's yelling at me because we're only passing in one name. So I need to pass in two names. But here that's get username, I can only use this for getting the user's first name. That doesn't seem like it makes a whole lot of sense because I've got to create this same thing over again. I'm going to copy and I'm going to paste and say last name. Now I've got to say user's last name. And this code looks an awful lot like this code. And so here's where you run across a best practice, and it's a pattern we have to follow. And that's dry, D-R-Y. And I use this a lot because it's one of my favorite things to reference because it just makes your applications better. So dry stands for don't repeat yourself, D-R-Y. And the thought is if you see yourself doing the same code over and over, maybe you should rethink that. So in this case, it's the same code over and over again. It's just we're changing first to last. Well, what if we did this differently? So let's do this. Let's pass in string message. And then instead of saying, what's your first name? We could say message. So this gets a user's name. Doesn't matter if it's first name or last name now. So now we can come up here and say, what is your first name? And pass that in for get user's name. And here we'll say first name to be more clear. And we'll say first name here. But we still need last name. No problem. I'll copy and I'll paste and I'll change this to last name and say, what is your last name? And now I can say welcome and the last name. So I use that method twice for two different name types. One's the first name, one's the last name. No problem. I just changed this text right here that I'm passing in. It still captures the input from the console as the output, sends it back out. I put it in my variable. Now I could be even more generic and say get string from console. And then I could get it from more, you could use it just as it is for more than just names. Maybe I could get their age too. What is your age? And it just gets that information back out of the console. But just as it is, I can run this. And it says, what is your first name? Tim. What is your last name? Corey. Hello, Tim, Corey. You see how powerful that is? Just a few tweaks. And I'm passing in both first name and last name. I'm getting both first name and last name without rewriting this code. And I can still read, say author, get user's name, welcome user, and then we're done. So kind of makes it a little easier for expanding your application using it over and over and over again. Imagine if this was a large application. How many times do we get information off the console? All the time. So having a little method that gets the information off for us easily, prints that message out, formats it nicely, and maybe does other stuff. Because quite frankly, we're probably doing more than just these 3 lines of code. For example, in a business application, you might be logging that this call was made. You might be logging the information that comes back and saying, okay, we asked the user this, and this is the result. And it's kind of put that in a log file somewhere so you know that we asked the user for the information. And there's a lot of other things you could do in this method. But even just this saves us writing this syntax and making sure it's right. Maybe down the road you say, you know what? We don't want to have these lines one after the other. So we'll put a console write line before each one and after each one. And give us a little more space. So again, lots of things you can do now that you have these things broken apart into methods. But that's a method. Passing in 2 variables, just put a comma in the next one. That's 2 parameters. If you want a third one, comma, another one. And again, these types could be ints, bools, any other type you want. You can pass in. The return type, all you gotta do is say return. Now, if you have an if statement in your method, you have to make sure that you also have an else statement or you have the return outside the if statement. For example, if I said, let's just cut this for now, if output dot length, because you can do a length of a string, is greater than, let's just say 1, return output. Well, what happens if it's not greater than 1? It won't return anything. returns a value if we promised to return a value. Now, it may be that if we had this if statement here, and we said, you know what? If they don't give us a length greater than 1, there's a problem. So we could say else return there was a problem. Not the best solution because that now goes in as the user's name. There was a problem. Or maybe we say, you know what? The name becomes unknown. Let's just try this out. Because both if and else, that you have to hit one of those two, it satisfies the all code paths return a value. First name is Tim. Last name, I'm just going to hit enter. Hello, Tim unknown. You see how both worked? We got here return output for Tim because his length is greater than 1. But for just enter, that length was 0. Therefore, it returned unknown. So there's ways of doing branching logic and still returning the values. Honestly, you don't have to have this else. You could just say return unknown. And you may say, well, wait. Why would you do that? Because wouldn't that overwrite the previous return? Nope. Because remember I said that return ends it right there. So if I were to run this again and say, let's just say blank for the first name and Corey for the last name. Unknown Corey. Because when we got to this here for Corey or for the blank, it said, nope, that's not true. Therefore, skip this code and go right down here, return unknown. But when I came to Corey, it said, yes, this is true. Therefore, return Corey, stop. Don't come down here and run this code. So once you hit return, just know you're done. So let's just go back to where you were. Return output. And that's really all there is to methods. We're going to get into more in-depth methods once we hit our beginning of object-oriented programming, because that's when we start using methods more often and getting into what's private versus public versus all the rest. But for now, this is a great start into practicing breaking apart your application into bite-sized chunks. Okay, so that brings us to our tip. A method should do one thing. Then name it by what it does. So don't call our method method 1. That's hard to read. How do I know what method 1 does? But if I call, let's just pretend I'm going to create a method on the fly. I'm not going to tell you what the code does. But here's the method name. Read the user's age. What's it going to do? It's going to read the user's age. Or maybe a better name would be get the user's age. What's it going to do? It's going to get the user's age. I mean, that in itself is the description of what it does. So it makes it really easy when you're reading through code to understand what each little chunk does. So a method should do one thing. It should have one task or purpose in existence. And then you should name it by what that one thing or one purpose is. Okay, so let's go to your homework. Your homework is to create a welcome method, a method to ask the user's name, and another to tell that user hello. So you'll have 3 methods besides your static void main. So a welcome method, a method to ask for the user's name, and another to tell that user hello and their name. So hello, Tim. Okay? So 3 methods, and then also your static void main, of course. Once you get that done, then move on to the next lesson.